Good morning. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Perry, a respirologist with a special interest in asthma and as it relates to genetics and the environment. So that's what we're going to talk about. So Dr. Perry, is all asthma caused by genetic factors then?
Well, Veda, the answer is yes and no. So all people who develop asthma have some genetic susceptibility to develop that asthma. So they've inherited variants of some genes that modify their reaction to environmental factors and increase the likelihood that they will develop asthma. Most people who develop asthma have some family history, maybe not a father or mother, but an uncle or aunt. There's usually some kind of family history, but sometimes there's not. But even if there's not, that doesn't mean there's not genes involved. But to understand this, you have to recognize that there's two major kinds of genetic disease. The so-called single gene Mendelian disorders, where a single mutated gene is necessary and sufficient to produce the disease. And an example of that is cystic fibrosis, another lung disease, much rarer than asthma. But in cystic fibrosis, if you inherit an abnormal transmembrane regulator from your father and an abnormal gene for the transmembrane regulator from your mother, then inevitably you will get cystic fibrosis. How bad your cystic fibrosis is may be influenced by your environment, how early you're detected or treated, but inevitably you get cystic fibrosis. So one gene, one disorder, environment has very small effect. In asthma, it's very different. First of all, there's probably multiple variants of genes that are inherited from mother and father that increase your chances of getting asthma, not inevitably get asthma. So they increase your chances that with the proper environmental triggers, like maybe allergens, maybe viruses, maybe pollutants at the right point in your life, you will have a response that then generates the asthma kind of syndrome. But having the genes is sufficient, and having the environmental factors isn't sufficient alone. You've got to have both the susceptibility and the environmental exposure. So is asthma genetic? Yes, but if we had a perfectly clean environment with no exposures, we could still have those genes, but we would have no asthma. So it's a combination.
Okay, so we may know a lot about genetic factors as they affect asthma, but there's a lot more to find out.
There's a lot more to find out, yeah. But I think we've learned a lot in the last few years because of these studies I was talking about, the genome-wide association studies, where we can now interrogate the whole genome with no preconceived notion of what genes may be involved. And it's through this that we've found some really exciting new avenues to explore. One of them is that the lining of the lungs, the epithelial cells which line the airways, seem to play a much more important role than we used to think. We always used to think it was all allergy. But now it's the response of that lining cells of the lung. Some people have an exaggerated response, and it may be that exaggerated response that then initiates the allergy. So the allergy may not be the primary thing. It may be secondary to this exaggerated epithelial airway lining response. So the genetics has helped us a lot. We're a long way from having a genetic test, right? We're nowhere near saying, doing a test on someone's child and saying, your chances of getting asthma are this, and therefore you should avoid this and this and this. So the genetics has taught us potential new mechanisms of genesis of asthma. We're not yet at a genetic prediction of asthma to modify lifestyle or anything like that.
But if there are genetic factors involved, why do we often hear that children will grow out of their asthma?
Right. Well, I think this is two factors. One is that children are especially susceptible to asthma because their airways are small. I mean, kids are small, so the airways are small, but they're even smaller than the kids are small. In other words, airways are relatively smaller in kids than they are in adults. So that anything that causes a little bit of smooth muscle contraction in the airways or edema, thickening, swelling of the airways tends to cause wheezing. So kids, because of their small airways, tend to, when they develop an allergic reaction or this asthmatic response, they present with symptoms. As you grow older, your lungs grow and your airways especially grow, and so the airways get bigger, and people, although they may retain the asthmatic state, their symptoms lessen. The other thing is that the immune system changes as you age too, and so the intensity of the allergic response to allergens decreases as we age. Interestingly though, in women, the incidence, in boys, asthma goes down as you go into puberty. In women and girls, it goes up. And we still don't know the explanation for that. But if you look at a population of asthmatics in their 20s, there's more girls or boys, more women than men. And if you look at age 7, it's more boys than girls.
So that's yet another genetic factor to study.
Well, it's genetic and environment. If you think of the hormones as environmental.
Okay. And what role does the environment play in asthma?
Yeah, well, the environment plays a big role, I think. As I said, without something in the environment, even if you had those susceptibility genes, you wouldn't develop asthma. So the trouble is, it's complex, right? There's this one idea that so-called the hygiene hypothesis is that the problem is that we cleaned up our environment too much. So there's a whole school of thought that exposure of kids to dirty environments and, having dogs in the home and going to daycare and playing in the mud is good for you. And the hypothesis is that being exposed to all those things modulates your immune response in a way that was meant to respond to bacteria and things like that. Whereas if we clean up our environment too much, then the immune system has to do something, and it starts to respond to allergens like house dust mite or ragweed or something like that, and makes an excessive response. And there's some epidemiologic evidence, like people who grow up on farms, exposed to farm animals, have less asthma. Kids who have dogs when they're growing up have less asthma. So there's some evidence that dirt is good for you. But there's also evidence that viral infections and air pollution can increase the incidence of asthma. So it's very confusing. Clearly, though, the environment is important. Are we at a stage where we can write out for a mother how to modify the environment to prevent asthma in their child? No. We know that exposure to cats in some individuals can cause an allergic reaction. So when we can link asthma attacks to specific environmental factors, then we can act on that, right? And we can suggest that the kids don't play with the cat, or you actually get rid of the cat. When someone develops wheezing or hives when they eat strawberries, that's pretty clear. Those environmental factors. But the environmental factors that either produce or stop producing asthma in general is still not clear. So, I don't think we can write prescriptions for environmental modification yet.
And that's part of why asthma then changes in individuals over time, often?
Right. I think the environment changes over time. Your genes don't change, although as I was explaining, there is this whole new field called epigenetics, which is where environmental exposures, changes your DNA. Not the DNA sequence, the base pair sequence that makes up your genetic code. You can't change that. That's what you're born with. That's what you die with. But you can have chemical modifications of the DNA that turns off and on particular regions of the DNA. And so it really is like changing your genes, and environmental factors can do that. They can make chemical modifications to your DNA structure. So exciting part about that is now we have a mechanism about how the environment interacts with your DNA to change its function. And that we're just in the infancy of this whole new era called epigenetics, right? There was the Human Genome Project, now there's the Human Epigenome Project. So as usual, researchers will say there's a lot more work to be done.
I see that.
Yes.
Thank you. It's an
Okay.
interesting start.
Thank you.